At the time of this video's release, November 2025, it will have been 2 decades since we lost the great Eddie Guerrero, star of Mexico, Japan, WCW, ECW, and WWE. And I remember when I was first getting into wrestling as a child, Eddie Guerrero was, at the time, just kind of a mid-card heel who I wanted to see people like The Rock and Steve Austin beat. It wasn't until I got back into wrestling later in life when I realized, as many people already had, oh, this guy was really special. And I would describe Eddie Guerrero as my first rediscovered favorite wrestler. I had favorites in childhood who remained favorites, like Steve Austin. I had new favorites when I got back into wrestling who I wasn't aware of back then, like CM Punk. And I had people I didn't really care about too much back then who are now firm favorites indeed. And for me, Eddie Guerrero is like first and foremost among those. So I thought, as a bit of a tribute to his amazing talent, why not take a look back at the history of Eddie Guerrero's greatest matches. Just before we dive in, if you want to get your hands on some lovely blacksmith apparel, click the link in the description, use the code JOBBER15 to get 15% off. And as always, a huge shout out to everybody over at my Patreon as well. Right, without any further ado, let's get into it. Eddie was born into the Guerrero wrestling family, the youngest son of Gory Guerrero. In his youth, he would wrestle with his nephew during the intermission of events held by his father in El Paso, Texas. That nephew, of course, being Chavo Guerrero Jr., who, despite being his nephew, was only 3 years younger than Eddie. Going into the family business, much of Eddie's early career was spent in Mexico, and in the early 90s, he became a member of AAA's tag team division, as well as occasionally wrestling overseas as part of New Japan Pro Wrestling under a mask as Black Tiger. Now, I am thoroughly terrified of using a New Japan image on YouTube for even a slight second, so you'll just have to imagine what he looked like in this role. Or just Google Black Tiger Eddie Guerrero, and that'll come up straight away. In April 1994, he took part in a now legendary one-night tournament over in New Japan. He didn't play a huge role, only making it to the second round where he was knocked out by Wild Pegasus, the New Japan alter ego of a man that he would go on to clash with numerous times throughout his career, as we'll see, Chris Benoit. Their collective story, as we all know, would ultimately end in tragic and haunting fashion. But despite not making it very far in this tournament in 1994, upon reflection, Eddie's presence there helps complete a legendary lineup. He didn't just share the card with Benoit, but with names like Liger, Hayabusa, Great Sasuke, Otani, El Samurai, and Taka Michinoku as well, all in one night, all in the same tournament. Later that year, still as Black Tiger in New Japan, Eddie would take part in what I think counts probably as the first truly great match of his career. That was the World Tag League Final, alongside the Great Sasuke, taking on Pegasus and Shinjiro Otani. And although it's a tag match in a promotion not particularly associated with Eddie's career above some of the other ones, I still think it's quite an appropriate starting point when we talk about his catalogue of great matches. That's because even though I wasn't familiar with it and I watched it for the first time while researching this video, it really gets across the versatility of Eddie as an in-ring performer. It's far more of a wild brawl than I expected as well. Maybe brawling's not the quality we associate most with Eddie, but it's on full display here. And then once that initial explosion in the match has really settled down, then we see Eddie keep up the intensity, keep up the complexity of his in-ring exchanges, and just dazzle everybody with his talent. The match is a great starting point to showcase his technical ability, his high-flying lucha libre skills, and, perhaps most surprisingly for those of us who might think of Eddie Guerrero more as a sneaky sort of heel, it really shows his brutality as well. It's a very sadistic performance from Guerrero. Unfortunately, the finish prevents the match from being as great as it could have been in my opinion. The babyface team hit Eddie with a very overly ambitious, in hindsight, kind of doomsday device into Flying Hurricane Rana sort of thing. Obviously it goes wrong, but Eddie still sells it really well, lying there as if he's been completely knocked out by what is a very messy but still devastating impact. Shinjiro Otani flops into the cover. For some reason, the referee just refuses to count the fall, so then Otani gets up, hits Eddie or Black Tiger with a bridging dragon suplex to pick up the win. So yeah, a bit of a messy finish, but still a great showcase of Eddie's future talent. Just a few weeks later, he would return to AAA in Mexico and take part in a far more famous tag team match, one whose legacy has really stood the test of time. This was at the When Worlds Collide event, co-hosted by AAA and WCW, in which Eddie would team with his tag partner Art Barr against the babyface team of Octagon and the man Eddie had betrayed earlier on to turn heel in AAA in the first place, El Hijo del Santo. This rivalry was intensified by two things. One, the fact that Eddie's father, Gory Guerrero, had teamed with El Hijo del Santo's father, El Santo. And the second thing was the rules of the match, a 2 out of 3 falls, hair versus mask stipulation. And for those who've never seen this match before, it could be quite a jarring watch, because those who are more familiar with the latter stages of Eddie's career know how much he was proud of his Mexican heritage, but here, for heelish effect, he's really hamming up the American side of his heritage, and it works really well. And it's worth noting that this was not a tactical misstep. You might be thinking, but the event took place in Los Angeles. Yes, but there was a huge Latin American audience in attendance. And it's a really good match to watch in contrast with the previous one I talked about in New Japan, because here Eddie is a totally different kind of heel. Yes, he's despicable. Yes, we still really want to see him lose, but he's kind of cowardly and buffoonish at times, and it's a totally different side, once again showing his versatility. The story of the match is quite fast and loose, and there's a real flurry of pinfalls throughout, because it takes both members of a team to be eliminated to then advance to the next fall. And the very first elimination of the match demonstrates Eddie's crazy athleticism, especially in his youth, where he pretty much nails that exact spot that I talked about going wrong in the New Japan match, but this time he's on the offensive side of things, and it gains him the first fall of the match. It's really well done. Of course, the babyfaces fight back and get the win. El Hijo del Santo on his own, pretty much, to be honest. And the heels, Eddie Guerrero and Art Barr, cut each other's hair to honour the stipulation. I don't know if the action in this match makes it one of Eddie's very top matches, but the intensity of the crowd, their molten hot reactions, and the high stakes at play all work in its favour. The heels themselves are fantastic, and I do think that the performances of Eddie Guerrero and Art Barr are the real story of this match when you watch it back. But only just a few weeks after this, Art Barr would pass away in his sleep. This would have a profound effect on Eddie, not just emotionally, but in terms of his wrestling style as well, as he would famously adopt the frog splash, Art Barr's finisher, as his own for the remainder of his career. With his profile now quite boosted, Eddie was then signed by Paul Heyman to ECW, where he quite quickly won the TV title from Too Cold Scorpio. From there, he would enter into a now famous feud with, like Chris Benoit, another man who would be forever associated with Eddie's legacy. That man being Dean Malenko. The pair squared off for Eddie's TV title at Hostile City Showdown in a match which very quickly becomes a very gritty chess match. And it's interesting because we see both men not only use their own style of wrestling, but also partake in their opponent's style as well. We see Eddie get down and dirty with the technical amateur grappling sort of stuff, and we see Dean Malenko demonstrate a bit of nimble lucha ability as well. I think it's quite reminiscent of a modern day Zack Sabre Jr. match, very patient, but then there's bursts of activity, and every minuscule advantage in the match is really fought for and earned by either man. Eddie takes things high risk with an attempted splash to the outside, but Malenko reverses it as Eddie falls towards him. It's a really nasty bump, but really effective as well. But Malenko can't quite press the advantage back in the ring, although he does kick out of the frog splash. With time running out, both men go for desperate pinning combination after pinning combination, with neither man able to fully put the other one away, and we get that most divisive of match endings, a time limit draw. I really like this one. It's not for everyone, but what I will say is, if you've never seen it, definitely give it a shot, because if it is your sort of thing, oh, it's very, very good. The pair would then go 5 minutes even longer in a rematch, which also went to a time limit draw, and is also worth a watch. But for me, it lacks a slight bit of the intensity that makes the first one so special. Also the element of surprise, because that first one nobody really knew was going to go to a time limit draw, but you would suspect it going into the rematch. Eddie would then don the Black Tiger mask again, this time to take part in New Japan's illustrious Best of the Super Juniors tournament. There in the semi-final, he again met Wild Pegasus, Chris Benoit, in a very grueling match where both men get quite desperate and take some big risks to win. In the end, it is Pegasus who does so, nailing Eddie with, of all things, an avalanche tombstone piledriver to take the win, advance to the final, and ultimately win the whole tournament. It's a good match, but we will certainly be back to check out the sequel, because it's very special indeed. In the meantime, Eddie headed back to the States, where he exchanged the TV title back and forth in a couple more rematches with Dean Malenko. After being on opposite sides of a very fun six-man tag team match featuring some very notable characters, what are you doing, guys? Stop being silly, get down from there. Eddie would finally wrap up his feud with Malenko in a 2 out of 3 falls match. This match has a great atmosphere, but a very poignant one as well, and that's because the ECW crowd are very aware that not only Malenko but Eddie as well are both about to depart and sign with WCW. And even before the match has begun, there are chants of "please don't go." It's a strange change of pace from the rest of their rivalry, which until this point has been ultra competitive. And this match is still very competitive indeed, but there's kind of a general sense of goodwill as well. This is the end of something and it's very bittersweet and should be celebrated, this rivalry between these two men. And it feels more like a face versus face encounter than the quite bad-tempered nature of the rivalry to this point. Eddie wins the first fall after pulling a roll-up out of nowhere, but Malenko evens the score with his signature Texas Cloverleaf. The momentum swings back and forth in the final fall until, in what I feel is a very fitting finale, both men pin each other simultaneously and the referee calls the match a draw. Then we get a genuinely very touching scene after the bell as both men are paraded around the ring on the shoulders of their locker room roster mates, with again the crowd chanting, "please don't go." One thing I will say, and hopefully, this isn't too much of a drawback or a criticism towards a match that I do think deserves to be remembered as among Eddie's best. But one slight drawback anyway, is that this is a rare case of it not feeling like an Eddie Guerrero showcase, but more a showcase for his opponent. This is more of a Dean Malenko match than an Eddie one. But again, maybe that just speaks to Eddie's ability to not only put the spotlight on himself, but also be very selfless in the ring when the moment requires it. Anyway, a very nice send-off from ECW, and then Eddie would move down south to WCW, where he would resume his feud with Wild Pegasus, but in this case, Chris Benoit. In October 1995, the pair of them put on a sub-10-minute TV bout, which I've seen many people describe online as one of the finest matches in the early history of Monday Nitro. If I knew more about the early days of Nitro and the various matches that took place in those years, I would hopefully be inclined to agree. I'll just say anyway, it probably is. They're probably right, because it's really good. That's because the pair are out to prove themselves in front of perhaps a little bit of an unfamiliar audience. It's weird and quite funny looking back to hear the crowd audibly gasp at the slickness of some of Eddie's now signature arm drag and head scissor reversals. At the same time though, Benoit is relentless here, smashing Eddie with a very brutal powerbomb and taking advantage of an arm injury to put him away with a lovely bridging suplex. Before too long, Eddie found himself on WCW's biggest card of the year, Starrcade 95, which this time around featured not only WCW roster members, but also a series of point-scoring matches between the stars of WCW and the stars of New Japan as well. Eddie's match saw him take on Shinjiro Otani, a familiar foe, because if you remember, he was Benoit's tag team partner in that tag match we talked about near the start of the video. It's interesting to see Eddie in full babyface mode here, quite naive babyface mode as well, having to be really plucky and really brave to stand up to all of Otani's sneaky, bullying, heelish tactics. But as the match loosens up and both men start to take bigger risks, it's ultimately Eddie who falls victim to the wiliness of his opponent, who catches him with a roll-up to score a point for New Japan. Don't worry though guys, because WCW would win the event overall thanks to heroic point-scoring performances from our heroes Randy Savage and Sting. Come on guys, USA! I don't know what I'm doing. In 1996, Eddie aligned with Arn Anderson, but then Arn betrayed him to join up with his old stable, the Four Horsemen, and this all led to Eddie Guerrero versus the leader of the Horsemen, Ric Flair, in what nowadays would be like an ultimate intergenerational dream match. But in 96, I wouldn't describe it as maybe one of Eddie's most brilliant matches, but I would describe it as one of his most fascinating. He is obviously the underdog here against such a big star like the Nature Boy, but Flair gives Eddie a lot in this match. I think clearly portraying Eddie as the better man if this were a totally fair fight. And I've seen people say that if Flair had been a bit younger, this match would have been an all-time great. But I think Flair being slightly past his prime is very much part of the story here. He can barely keep up with Eddie and has to delve into his old bag of tricks just to stay in there. He also benefits from a huge dose of luck as Eddie injures his leg, setting him up perfectly, of course, for the figure 4 leg lock. Although with that move still locked in, Flair still has to resort to cheating to get the win. In the summer of '96, Eddie headed back over to New Japan for another Best of the Super Juniors tournament, so that again means that unfortunately for a little bit, the images are going to disappear. Now Black Tiger once again, Eddie enjoyed a very fruitful time in this tournament, the pick of his early round robin kind of opening round matches being against Shinjiro Otani. But now the dynamics are reversed again, and now that Eddie's a heel, he ruthlessly picks Otani's leg apart. I think that it's clearly a better match than their Starrcade one, and the crowd really comes alive when Otani bravely battles back to ultimately defeat Eddie, but not knock him out of the tournament. He had picked up enough wins elsewhere to advance to the knockout stages, and in the semi-final, in a rematch of the previous year's semi-final, he would once again take on Wild Pegasus. This one is quality. And this time, Black Tiger gets his revenge. This match is a constant struggle, and even though Benoit or Pegasus is on top for most of it, Eddie's never quite out of there. It's a real competitive one. The match is great all the way through, but my favourite part is, without question, the finish, which if you've never seen, please do seek it out. It's outrageous. Both men survive the best of what the other can give them. Eddie manages to survive the thing that knocked him out the year before, the jumping tombstone, and wins with, of all things, a picture-perfect avalanche brainbuster, which sounds difficult, surely is, and is delivered to perfection. In fact, I think up until this stage of Eddie's career, we could maybe count it as his best match ever. In the early years, I think it's between this one and maybe the original time limit draw against Dean Malenko. Very different styles, but both brilliant matches. And also, this win means that Eddie would move on to the final of the '96 Best of the Super Juniors against none other than Jushin Thunder Liger. I don't think maybe, and I'm a bit of a spoilsport here, I don't think that this is maybe the most sensible match of either Eddie or Liger's career. There's some very dubious kickouts, there's some frankly illogical swings in momentum if we're looking at it through an analytical eye. But at the same time, mechanically, it's a wonderful performance in ring. Maybe not in terms of psychology, but just in terms of what they can do. And if you look at the names in the match, Eddie and Liger, that won't be too much of a surprise. And I think my favourite thing about this match is the result. I was genuinely taken aback because expecting Liger to be the all-conquering, home nation hero, it's actually Eddie, it's actually Black Tiger who wins the '96 Best of the Super Juniors, again winning with that big brainbuster. Eddie spent the rest of '96 back in WCW kind of milling around, not really getting the push that we could definitely argue he deserved, but maybe it's a little bit understandable given that this is the year that Hulk Hogan sensationally turned heel and the whole wrestling world was turned upside down with WCW at the very centre of it. But as we'll see, this story never really changed for Eddie in WCW. He never did quite get that push he deserved, even in later years when maybe they needed a bit of a change towards the top of the card. Still, in '96, there were some good matches against Psychosis, there was a feud with Diamond Dallas Page, which ended with Eddie winning the United States title, but nothing I think really in that career best kind of bracket. 1997 began for Eddie at the sold-out pay-per-view with a ladder match against Six, or X-Pac. It sounds like it would be a hidden gem. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it's kind of not. Likewise for a match against Chris Jericho, which I think was dragged down by an unenthusiastic crowd, and also a resumption of his old feud with Dean Malenko. Again, at this time, I don't think Eddie was in a particular funk or anything like that. I just don't think the crowd were really helping. Although some people do like that Malenko match. It was that uncensored, and I've seen some people say they prefer it to the feud they had in ECW. And I think those people are crazy. Yes, it's kind of more mean-spirited and bad-tempered than their kind of strictly competitive ECW matches, but I think the crowd are kind of sick of Eddie as a babyface at this point. He didn't really have much of an edge to him, or wasn't allowed to demonstrate the edge we would very much later see. It's also dragged down, in my opinion, by a cheap finish involving interference from Six. Check it out if you want. I wouldn't personally class it as like top tier. After losing the US title, Eddie would take a few months off and then return at Fall Brawl to turn heel and win the Cruiserweight Championship from Jericho. And while not the most spectacular match, I think this is a very important one because it represents a key step in the evolution of Guerrero's character. From even the opening stages, it's very evident that this is a new Eddie Guerrero, more petulant, more petty, a different type of heel, maybe more similar to his old AAA version of himself. You can tell this from the early moments where he complains about an imaginary hair pull on a completely routine arm drag from Jericho. A wonderful kind of old school heelish spot, a nice trick, to get heat straight away. Eddie takes some huge bumps as well in this match during Jericho's comeback, but ultimately wins the Cruiserweight Championship, a reign which would, shortly after this, feature a far more famous match. I think you'll probably know what it is if I say the words Halloween Havoc. At Halloween Havoc 97, Eddie took on Rey Mysterio Jr., and with Eddie's title and Rey's mask on the line, the two of them went out and put on one of the most famous and possibly the best match in the entire history of the promotion. In under 15 minutes, Eddie and Rey put on a match which you could feasibly say is a decade or two ahead of its time. The pace is relentless and the agility is astounding, and while some people might see this as a showcase of Rey's ability more than Eddie's, I think Guerrero is there with him every step of the way, always preventing the match from becoming like a spot fest and always infusing it with that gritty, heelish energy. There are several very famous spots here. The big springboard into the DDT, the flying dive into the head scissors on the outside of the ring, but I think my favourite is the very final spot of the match. Rey somehow reversing a avalanche razor's edge attempt into a crazy Hurricane Rana or Frankensteiner for the win. It's astounding, and if you've never watched it, oh my god, go and watch it now. It's on YouTube, but then come back here, obviously, please. So this would be the start of Eddie and Rey really being propelled up the card, right? You can't totally steal the show like that and still be ignored, can you? You would think so. Eddie won the title back shortly after this, and the pair would have a decider at the World War III pay-per-view, which is still very impressive, but not a patch on Halloween Havoc. He would then have another defense against Dean Malenko, this time at Starrcade, and then ultimately lose the belt to Ultimo Dragon. But still, Eddie's time in WCW was largely a very frustrating one. 1998 saw a twisted kind of alliance with Eddie's nephew Chavo, culminating in a match between the two at Bash at the Beach, after which Chavo shaved his head. It sounds like it would be a really intense and impressive personal feud between two men who surely would have amazing chemistry together. Unfortunately, I don't think WCW's focus in booking this feud was quite in the right place. Should have been on the ring work. At this stage, Eddie also began to rail against the system with a series of worked shoot kind of tirades against the man in charge, Eric Bischoff. How much, though, of a work is a work if there are real shoot feelings behind it? It's a riddle. That's because, as we know, Eddie had real-life frustrations with his lack of a push in WCW, and he was not alone. He shared this feeling with a number of very, very talented individuals on the undercard. Names we've talked about already, like Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, and people we haven't touched upon yet, like Perry Saturn. Hold on to those names, they will become important later on. But on screen, Eddie's frustrations resulted in the formation of the stable, the LWO. The group's primary aim seemed to be to recruit Rey Mysterio, but he actually refused to do so, in fact costing Eddie a match against Billy Kidman at Starrcade. A car crash over the holiday period saw Eddie miss much of 1999, but even when he returned, things just continued to go downhill. He couldn't gather any momentum. He was now a member of the Filthy Animals stable and really just not able to gain much of a purchase in terms of TV time. So there was only really one thing for it: the inevitable jump to the WWF. But if you think this is like the launching pad for the remainder of Eddie's career and from here on he was a bona fide main eventer, that's not quite how things panned out yet. Granted a release from his contract from the tanking WCW, Eddie jumped over as part of the Radicals, a stable formed between Eddie, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko and Perry Saturn, and Chris Jericho had already joined the WWF the year prior. But in the year 2000, when they first arrived on the scene in the Fed, the Radicals' star was clearly Chris Benoit, not Eddie Guerrero. Eddie was very much kept in the mid-card, and he met some success and had some featured moments on TV. He won the European title, and he had his now famous on-screen relationship with China. I think Eddie did really well to stand out at this time, because his strength was his wrestling, his in-ring ability. That's not really what a mid-card wrestler could rely upon in WWF during the Attitude Era, with a lot of TV time being given to chaotic segments involving the main eventers, and on pay-per-view, again, the undercard matches weren't really featured that much, unless it was something like the Hardys and the Dudleys and Edge and Christian in the tag division, but the European title picture, not so much. But a key development took place around this time for Eddie, not in terms of his greatest matches, but in terms of his character development. And that would pay dividends massively later on down the line. This role allowed Eddie to develop and flourish on the microphone and in backstage segments like never before in his career. If you watch some of his earlier promos, they weren't really that good. It's a startling improvement. He was allowed to demonstrate his cartoonish villainy, his quick wit, and most importantly, I think as well, in maintaining a connection with the crowd despite being a heel, he was allowed to demonstrate his sense of humour. Eddie should have been a despicable character at this point. Nobody should have liked Eddie Guerrero by design. He was a terrible partner to China. He pinned her to win the IC title and pretended it was a mistake. He was furious at her Playboy cover shoot. He was caught in the shower with two of the Godfather's ladies. But the problem was, and WWE would realise this later on, Eddie was just too likeable to remain in such a role forever. But he was kept a mid-card heel for the time being, losing a feud with Billy Gunn, which resulted in the end of his IC title reign. That's quite a period of drought, you might say, in terms of great matches. You could argue that the last truly great match Eddie had at this stage was way back at Halloween Havoc 97 with Rey Mysterio. This would change very, very soon. Along with Benoit, Eddie took part in a very entertaining Fatal 4-Way match at the No Way Out 2001 pay-per-view, also featuring Jericho and X-Pac. This bout furthered tensions between Benoit and Eddie, and not long after this, Benoit was ousted from the Radicals, which Eddie assumed the leadership of. Perhaps now he could concentrate on being a really serious heel, especially now that his storyline with China was in the past. A bruising encounter with Benoit on Monday Night Raw was a very impressive match, but more about elevating Benoit as this new babyface on the scene, rather than doing anything for Eddie. And then the wheels fell off. In May, Eddie was sent to rehab to deal with his addiction issues. Then he was arrested later on in the year, and then he was released from WWE. This sequence of events would have resulted in the end of a lot of wrestlers' careers. Certainly on that sort of stage anyway. They might have still carried on the indies or whatever, but to think that the best years of Eddie's career were ahead of him at this point would have been unthinkable. But in the meantime, Eddie did head to the indies, taking part in the United States' kind of bubbling, about to explode independent scene. And this little time frame contains some of the most unique matchups of Eddie's career. These are the ones I think are most notable. First, he took on a burgeoning version of the divisive, now indie legend / controversial figure, I guess, Low-Ki. This match is a really grapple-heavy grapple fest, with kind of a loose feel at times, as though it was mainly called in the ring, and I wouldn't have been surprised if it turns out that that was the case. It's quite reminiscent of his old ECW feud with Dean Malenko, and one of the things I was most struck by watching this match is how selfless Eddie is, despite being the big name. Low-Ki not only wins the match, but does so very deservedly as well. It's a clear win by a guy who is portrayed not just as the victor, but as the better man on the night too. And Eddie didn't have to do that. Another unique bout from this time was Eddie's match with Doug Williams in London, which showcased Eddie's ability to dip into that old school British wrestling style, which, until I watched this match, I'd never really seen him do too much. I'd seen him do technical stuff, but he can do like the pure British wrestling stuff very, very well indeed. It might not be the most thrilling match, but it's a very interesting one. I think, like I say, I knew Eddie was a very technically proficient wrestler, just maybe not this type of technique, and it turns out, yes he was. He just didn't feel the need to show it off that much. In March 2002, Eddie wrestled in IWS Mid-South, taking part in a triple threat match, which has kind of become mythological given its very unlikely lineup of wrestlers. He faced not only an unmasked Rey Mysterio, now kind of adrift after the collapse of WCW, but he also took on another up-and-coming star like Low-Ki by the name of CM Punk. I don't know if this match quite lives up to the hype. I mean, it would have done at the time, but retroactively, given the names involved, I don't know if it lives up to that level of hype. But I will say it's a match that really rewards patience, because it really picks up in the second half. And the finish legitimately caught me totally off guard as Eddie throws Rey out of the ring and pins Punk to win the title. Of course, this meant a rematch, now a singles match between Eddie and Punk, so that Eddie could drop the belt back. And it's pretty good. I think the triple threat's probably better. The singles match also features a bit of a tainted finish as Rey interferes to stop Eddie from cheating and hand Punk a slightly unclean victory. I think this match would have been better if Eddie was allowed to be the face and Punk could be his very petulant heelish self, as he was at the time. Watching this singles match back, it's very clear that this isn't the CM Punk that he would later become, although he wasn't that far off it, but this is clearly still Punk finding himself. It's just weird watching it knowing that Eddie himself also hadn't yet reached his full potential. After a few multi-man matches back in New Japan, Eddie was rehired by WWE in the spring of 2002. He entered into a feud with a man who had arrived during Eddie's stint in rehab, so a totally fresh opponent that he hadn't clashed with yet, Rob Van Dam. Here we see the first example of quite a strange trend in Eddie's career, where in a long feud where he'd have multiple noteworthy matches with somebody, occasionally, maybe more than occasionally actually, quite often, he would have his very best match with them on TV, not on pay-per-view. And that's the case here. That's not always the rule with Eddie's feuds, but it definitely happened to him more than it did most. After Eddie won the IC title from Van Dam at Backlash and then retained in a rematch at Judgment Day, he was finally beaten by RVD in a ladder match on Raw. This is possibly the single most chaotic match of Eddie Guerrero's career, but it's not through any fault of his own, and he kind of thrives amidst the carnage. This match is probably most remembered for being the match where a fan jumps the guardrail and quite terrifyingly shoves the ladder out from underneath Eddie as he's climbing towards the belt. Luckily, Guerrero manages to land on his feet. It's also noteworthy for a pretty unfortunate botch, RVD slipping during the planned finish of the match, a terrifying 5-star frog splash attempt from the top of the ladder, leading to a nasty fall. Thankfully, he was okay. Van Dam wins the belt, Eddie plays sore loser and attacks him, only for Van Dam to be saved by Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, apparently Austin and Eddie were set for a feud into the summer. Some people say that Austin specifically requested a feud with Eddie. He wanted fresh opponents who he knew were excellent in the ring, and Eddie fit the bill. Unfortunately, this was right around the time that Stone Cold infamously, quote, took his ball and went home. So sadly, due to frustrations between Austin and the creative department, we never saw this feud. We never saw what could have been. Eddie's next notable feud was with the now kind of rising singles star in babyface form, Edge. And again, it's an example of a rivalry where their best matches did not come on pay-per-view, but on TV instead, this time under a no DQ stipulation. If you remember this match like I do, and I definitely do because I love this match, you'll probably remember most the second half of the match, where it just becomes kind of an impromptu ladder match and features, I think, the single most beautiful sunset bomb I've ever seen. If you've seen it, you'll know, like Eddie over the top of the ladder, but it's unbelievable. But go and watch it back in its entirety, I would suggest, because I think I was caught off guard by just how good the first half of the match is as well. It's full of intensity and it's a really nasty one. It's certainly better than you'd expect from just a random SmackDown match. And even the referee gets taken out at one point because they're going at each other so much. It's possibly Eddie's greatest TV match of all time, and certainly a highlight of this portion of his career, following his rehiring by WWE. Now it's time to talk about the SmackDown 6. With WWE's new brand split in effect, SmackDown was quickly established as the superior of the two, purely just in terms of in-ring action, and that was largely down to the efforts of 6 wrestlers, often against each other. They were Eddie, his nephew Chavo, Rey Mysterio, Kurt Angle, Chris Benoit, and Edge. Eddie teamed with Chavo around this time as Los Guerreros. They were supposed to be heels. They lie, they cheat, they steal. You know, we all love the theme tune. Problem is, they were so damn shameless about this that the crowd again couldn't help but love them. The very charming Eddie and Chavo entered a tag team tournament for the newly established SmackDown exclusive version of the tag team titles and had a very spirited TV match against the, they're always butting heads kind of team of Angle and Benoit. Eddie and Chavo lost, Angle and Benoit went on to win the tournament, but things would really ramp up from here. After another successful win over Eddie and Chavo at Rebellion, Angle and Benoit would carry the belts into a 3-way elimination tag team match at Survivor Series 2002. I know what you're thinking. All 6 members of the SmackDown 6, this must have been electrifying. Oh no. I think this one's a tiny bit overrated. I'm sorry. But that's not Eddie's fault. The spotlight of this match is firmly on Angle and Benoit and the broken chemistry between them, which ultimately ends up being their undoing. I just feel like, Eddie's performance is really, really good. I just feel like there's some weird moments that aren't his fault that drag this match slightly down for me compared to, I've seen a lot of people really rave about it. I think there's some moments where like eliminations could happen and then the third team not involved stops it, which is very illogical to me. Also, we get quite a notable botch from, of all people, Rey Mysterio. But the result is a big moment for Los Guerreros as Eddie makes Rey submit with his submission finisher, the lasso from El Paso, and Eddie and Chavo scoop the belts. Unfortunately, despite winning tag team gold, the next few months for Eddie represent a little bit of a slide down the card around this time. Yes, he was still very much featured on pay-per-view and in TV title defenses, But at the same time, the results around this time would often remind us just where the company saw Eddie. He would lose to the likes of Billy Kidman, for example. Nothing against Billy. He also lost what I think is a slightly underwhelming match again against Benoit at Armageddon. A match which feels like they were given quite a lot of time, but told to go out there and just take things slow. I think most of us would rather have seen Eddie versus Benoit with half the runtime, but double the intensity. Now babyfaces, due to their very silly, rascalish ways, Eddie and Chavo lost the tag team titles to Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas, quite a new team on the scene, called the self-proclaimed world's greatest tag team. Unfortunately for the dethroned champions, Chavo would sustain a legitimate injury around this time, forcing Eddie to find a new tag team partner in his quest to reclaim the gold. He would choose fellow ECW alumni Tajiri, the Japanese buzzsaw, and the pair would win the belts in a ladder match on pay-per-view at Judgment Day. But again, the better stuff was on TV for me. The first rematch on SmackDown has some really slick in-ring exchanges, particularly between Eddie and Shelton Benjamin. But this match is all about the finish. In what is now a legendary part of his legacy, and one of the things that is most often replicated in modern wrestling to pay tribute to Eddie, we see the tricky DQ finish, the Eddie Guerrero finish, let's just call it that. Eddie hits the referee with a chair, throws the weapon to Charlie Haas, and pretends that Charlie did it, drawing the DQ victory. I think this is a really important stage of Eddie's career because it represents WWE finally kind of seeing what they didn't capitalize on back in the year 2000 with Eddie. The fact that even when he's being a rascal and cheating to win matches, the crowd love him even more for it. And this now represents WWE kind of running with that a little bit more. The second rematch saw another classic Eddie Guerrero finish with an impromptu kind of tug of war over one of the belts between himself and Charlie Haas, and then Charlie wins the tug of war, so Eddie just takes a bump, pretends to have been knocked out without the referee seeing, and then when the referee turns around, again, Haas is disqualified. Unfortunately, the makeshift tag team champions wouldn't last much longer, losing the belts once again, and this led to Eddie turning heel, betraying Tajiri, and slamming him onto the windshield of his lowrider. Now, a singles wrestler once again, Eddie would enter a tournament for the vacant United States title, reaching the final where he would face, who else? Chris Benoit. The action here is very, very good. It's probably worth a rewatch unless you're the type who is massively offended by screwy finishes, which can drag the enthusiasm for a match down. And in this case, it's Rhino who interferes to help Eddie pick up the undeserved win. Despite that, I still think this match deserves some praise. It's definitely one of his better pay-per-view matches from around this time. The chemistry between himself and Benoit is undeniable, and it's a nice blend of Eddie's previous heelish sides together as one. You've got, you know, the goofy, tricky villain and the slightly more sadistic, serious version of himself as well. Again though, Eddie proved too damn popular to stay a heel for too long, turning face again in the midst of his reign and feuding with a very young John Cena. He won that feud thanks to the return of Chavo. The pair also got revenge on Haas and Benjamin around this time, defeating them to win back tag gold and making Eddie a double champion. Unfortunately, neither reign ended that gloriously for Eddie. He lost the US belt to the Big Show in a feud that I guess Vince McMahon found funny, and he lost the tag belt to the Bashams as well. Remember the Bashams? Yeah. This would lead to a Chavo heel turn and a blow-off match at the Royal Rumble, which, like their original feud back in 1998 in WCW, perhaps wasn't quite as good as it could have been. However, just when it maybe seemed like Eddie was once again going to be stuck in the mid-card or upper mid-card forever, immortality was just around the corner. Now, it could be argued that Eddie Guerrero got very lucky around the start of 2004. A lot of stars aligned for Eddie at this time, one of them being Chris Benoit being moved from SmackDown over to Raw in the aftermath of his Royal Rumble win. That's because this left a vacuum at the top of the SmackDown card, now with Benoit over on Raw, and the then WWE champion on SmackDown, Brock Lesnar, about to shockingly leave WWE to pursue a career in the NFL. Basically, WWE needed a new champion over on SmackDown, preparing for Brock to go. And they needed one fast. And yes, people can definitely argue that Eddie got lucky, and that's fair enough. My view is that Eddie very much made his own luck. Despite being physically smaller than the average WWE main eventer, despite being more indie in his in-ring style, I suppose, as well, he was so talented and so charismatic that he just made himself undeniable. So when this opportunity presented itself, there really was nowhere else for WWE to turn. This was the best case scenario for them. And what a decision it turned out to be. So, after winning a mini rumble to become #1 contender to the WWE Championship, we get to Eddie Guerrero versus Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004. This match sees Eddie as the underdog like never before. And of course, Brock launches him around from the opening bell. But then Brock injures his leg, and this gives Eddie an opening back into the match. I think the really interesting thing about the story of this match is that it's just not enough. Eddie just doesn't have enough to combat this monster. No matter how much more skilled he is, or experienced, or intelligent, Brock's physical gifts are just too much to overcome. And then Eddie gets something that he perhaps didn't have for his entire career to this point. He gets a big break. Lesnar hits the F5 and the referee is taken out by the move as well. So Lesnar goes to use the title belt as a weapon. He's going to cheat to beat Eddie Guerrero, our hero, how dare you? And then Brock Lesnar is stopped by karma in the form of an almighty spear from the interfering Goldberg. I love how nobody cares about this interference. Like, the crowd are losing their minds at the prospect of Eddie beating Lesnar. It doesn't matter how he does it. Lesnar was about to cheat anyway. The crowd do not care. They are willing him on to I was going to say to finish the story, but kind of, yeah. Of course, it isn't that simple. Lesnar kicks out, and with Goldberg gone, it looks like it's curtains for Guerrero. Lesnar goes for another F5. Eddie reverses it. And I love that it's a reversal that gets this done for him, because Eddie's reversals are one of the most memorable things about his signature style. He reverses into a DDT, kind of out of the F5, DDT, onto the title belt, and then he heads up top, hits the frog splash with Taz on commentary, very fittingly screaming, "Eddie cheated," which of course he did. It's Eddie Guerrero. And he wins the WWE Championship. Now obviously, being WWE Champion, especially in the spring, means defending the title at WrestleMania. And so, at WrestleMania 20, where it all began again, Eddie defended the belt at Madison Square Garden against Kurt Angle. This one's kind of more similar to the Lesnar match than you might think. If you watch back, Eddie is so outmatched early on by this physically stronger amateur wrestling genius. Story of this one's really strong as well, with Angle repeatedly going for the ankle lock, and Eddie keeps reversing it, keeps getting out of it, but you can tell that the damage is gradually taking its toll on it. In what I think is a very, very well-conceived finish, Eddie undoes the laces on one of his boots out of the side of Angle, which means when Kurt next applies the ankle lock, Eddie slips out of the boot, catches a surprised Kurt in an immediate roll-up, hooks the ropes as well, bending the rules of course, it's Eddie Guerrero, out of the view of the referee and retaining the title on the grandest stage of all. Of course, it has to be mentioned that Eddie ended the night celebrating in the ring with Chris Benoit, who had just become World Heavyweight Champion after the main event, in scenes which are now very difficult to watch. And similarly hard to watch, but for very different reasons, is Eddie's next title defense at Judgment Day against John Bradshaw Layfield. It's that one, if you know it. This match really stands out as something different in Eddie's career from everything else we've seen already. I think a good comparison here would be Mick Foley. Because while the Hell in a Cell match between Foley and Undertaker wouldn't really be considered the greatest match of Mick Foley's career, it kind of defies being put into any sort of box. It's its own thing entirely. And that's also kind of how I view Eddie versus JBL. In contrast to the previous two big title defenses, it's JBL who's outmatched here, as Eddie goes after him with a babyface fire that we haven't seen from him too much until this point. It's just, with Eddie, there's always, cheekiness, there's charisma. Here, he's in direct attack mode. Of course, the match becomes memorable and scary after the chair shot. The referee goes down, they end up on the outside, JBL cracks Eddie with a chair shot, and Eddie performs one of the most notorious blade jobs in wrestling history. The remainder of this match is basically a horror movie come to life, but the villain is the babyface, with JBL just unable to stop this blood-soaked monstrosity, which just a few moments before was Eddie Guerrero, but has now been transformed into something completely different. Credit must also go to Bradshaw for selling the effects of Eddie's heroic defiance in the face of such a terrifying blade job, but of course this match is more about Guerrero. I think his comeback, when he's been beaten down and he's just a bloody mess, and then he starts to come back and fire up, and he's shimmying around the ring in his signature style while just soaked in blood. I think that's maybe the most single electrifying moment of Eddie's career. The crowd come alive. JBL at this point realizes he's up against something unbeatable. He tries to cheat, but Eddie low blows him and lays him out with the title belt in full view of the referee. It's a DQ loss for Eddie, but a moral victory like no other. Eddie would end up losing the title to JBL in a very dubious bull rope match, and then was cost a rematch, a cage rematch on TV by the interference of Kurt Angle. And while this did sadly transition Eddie away from the title scene, it did at least resume his feud with Kurt, which is always a good thing. The pair clashed at SummerSlam, but it was only given 13 minutes, and again, the better match would come on television, this time with a 2 out of 3 falls stipulation. If you've seen my previous video that I did with the same format, like the history of John Cena's greatest matches, you'll know that occasionally in his career, Cena would just have an inexplicably long TV match, and it would be very memorable. This match between Eddie and Kurt lasted just a shade under half an hour. And despite this, it's not often, I don't hear it mentioned that much as one of Eddie's greatest matches. I think it's really underrated. And I think it's really cleverly put together, because the bones of the match, basically you've got two excellent wrestlers having one for the purists. But they had just enough bells and whistles to keep the more casual audience hooked on the action as well. It's very intelligent. The first fall sees Angle hit Guerrero with a low blow out of the view of the referee, provoking a fiery Eddie into doing it back to Angle and getting DQ. Angle then dominates the second fall of the match, but is caught with a very pretty roll-up from Eddie to even the score. And then in the third fall, this is where the shenanigans come into play. The ref gets bummed, Eddie goes for another signature DQ finish, but is undone by interference from Kurt's ally, Luther Reigns. I think this ending is maybe why the match isn't so fondly remembered relative to its quality, in my opinion, because Luther Reigns' interference leads directly into Eddie being caught in the ankle lock and being forced to submit. I think there's enough good here, though, to outweigh any potential negative aspects of the match, because up until that point, it's a hell of a contest. Eddie spent the rest of the year, well, first he led a Survivor Series team against Kurt's team, and Eddie's team came out on top. Then at Armageddon, Eddie briefly found himself back in the title picture in a multi-man match, but JBL was able to squeak out of there with his own reign intact. January 2005 would see a nice twist on the classic Eddie DQ finish in a babyface versus babyface TV match against Rey Mysterio. Eddie tries the old belt trick with Rey, pretending he's been hit with the belt, but then the ref's still down, so Rey lays the belt on Eddie, and Rey pretends to be knocked out himself. And then when the ref comes to, Eddie has to, quite hilariously, it's a very slapstick moment, has to lie on top of the belt to try and hide it from the ref. Obviously the ref's like, "What are you hiding? Let me see." And in all the confusion, Eddie gets caught by a quick roll-up from Rey and loses the match. And even though he's a face, there's definitely an element of frustration about Eddie here. Remember that for just a little bit later. Eddie and Rey would actually team together again after this, defeating the Bashams at No Way Out to become tag team champions, although sadly, this would be Eddie's last ever championship of his career. Still co-champions, the pair would then wrestle each other at WrestleMania 21, a match which is definitely good and still worth a watch, but maybe a little bit underwhelming, because the hype was just so big, and the storyline heading into the match itself was that both men wanted to tear the house down and steal the show, which they didn't really end up doing. And I imagine the background behind the match, the real life story, would have been the same thing. They would have both wanted to tear the house down and were probably very disappointed that they only had a good match, not an all-timer. Anyway, Rey ended up winning the bout, further frustrating Eddie, who nonetheless still shook his friend's hand in the aftermath. But then a couple of incidents further soured things between Rey and Eddie. Rey accidentally cost Eddie a match against Kurt Angle, and the pair lost the tag team titles to Eminem. Not the rapper. You know who I mean. You know. Incidentally, from what I've read online, that match against Angle, the one where Rey accidentally cost Eddie, people seem to prefer that one to the 2 out of 3 falls match, which is clearly better, in my opinion. The earlier one's better. The only reason I can think that the majority of people disagree with me on this is just because there's no Luther Reigns in the second one. And I think that's not fair. So justice for Luther Reigns, you know? Anyway, all of this tension would lead to Eddie snapping and turning heel on Rey, leading to a feud which would be the last widely remembered feud of Eddie's career, centered around this obsession of Eddie's with beating Rey and just being unable to. The pair would clash at Judgment Day, And even though it's a match which features a DQ finish, with Eddie very petulantly using a chair after being unable to put his former friend away, I still think it's a very good match which really demonstrates once again Eddie's versatility. Here we see yet another shade of the heel Eddie Guerrero character, so late on in his career as well. We already knew that he could be sneaky and devious. We already knew that he could be fiery and sadistic. But this version of him is something else entirely. This is a more methodical, slow-paced Eddie Guerrero heel performance, obsessed with causing Rey pain rather than kind of battering his way through him or trying to use deception. Things would continue on SmackDown, where once again we would see the best match of an Eddie Guerrero feud on TV rather than on pay-per-view. It's also, I think, the last truly great match of Eddie's career, and arguably his most underappreciated match as well. The contrast, even though it's the two same men in the match, the contrast between this and Halloween Havoc could not be greater. This is much more slow-paced and also a lot more angry and violent. This is a great performance from both men. Rey even targets Eddie's weakened midsection at one point in something that's maybe characteristic of some baby faces, maybe more cold, tactical baby faces, but not typical of Rey Mysterio, and it really sells the desperation and the personal nature of this feud. Rey wins a bitter contest with a 619 and a springboard leg drop, and now Eddie is fully plunged into darkness. This could have been where the feud became really even more interesting. Instead, well, it became memorable, but it was kind of in a more cartoonish way for me. Eddie would, of course, drag Rey's son into things, fabricating this whole DNA. It's the custody of Dominic is what I'm talking about. Dominic's presence in the feud would lead to one of the most bizarre stipulations in WWE history. Yes, the custody of Dominic ladder match at SummerSlam 2005. It's a fun watch. It's not one of Eddie's best. Like, it's an exciting match, but again, it's a very flawed one. Not Eddie's fault, but various things do go wrong. Most notably and most famously, Vicky Guerrero infamously either missing her cue or being sent out late to stop Eddie from winning. So Eddie's there on the ladder, about to win, pull down the custody papers, and has to sort of stall for an awkwardly long time. Now, many people might remember this as the feud ender, big happy ending with Rey winning, hooray. No, the feud actually ended with Eddie winning in a steel cage match on TV. And this is perhaps a more fitting ending to the feud, a bit more serious, a bit more about Eddie's obsession with beating Rey rather than any of the other bits involved. And I do really like the finish as well. That's because Eddie is about to win via escaping the cage. Not just that, but out the cage door. Ugh, so boring. Instead, no, he turns back, heads up top, and hits a frog splash to, like, prove that he can beat Rey, put an exclamation point on the feud. And I think it's quite, even though it's a heel win, I think it's quite oddly satisfying. From there, sadly, it would not be too long before Eddie's tragic passing in November 2005. Before then, he would have one last run at a world title, losing a feud to Batista before turning face for the last time in his career. His final match was a short one, a Survivor Series team qualifier against Mr. Kennedy, which fittingly, and this is quite nice, Eddie won via DQ. And that's it, man. Eddie passed away on November 13th, 2005, leaving behind him a varied, impressive, brilliant legacy. Now, at the end of my John Cena video, I picked a Mount Rushmore of just 4 matches. So I'm going to try and do the same here. So first of all, I've narrowed it down to 10 favourites to pick from, and then I'll pick the final 4 from there. And those 10 are the AAA tag team match alongside Art Barr, the first Dean Malenko match in ECW, the time limit draw, the final Dean Malenko match in ECW, the 2 out of 3 falls time limit draw, the 1996 Best of the Super Juniors semi-final against Wild Pegasus, the match, of course, against Rey Mysterio at Halloween Havoc 97, the match against Edge no DQ on SmackDown in 2002, the title-winning match against Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004, the WrestleMania match against Kurt Angle, the JBL match, the Bloodbath at Judgment Day, and that match, the underrated one, as I say, against Rey Mysterio on SmackDown in 2005. So, out of those, I'm going to pick a final 4 of, I think, the Wild Pegasus match, the 96 Best of the Super Juniors semi-final, really good. Halloween Havoc 97 has to be in there. I'm also going to pick the Edge match. Now, you might think there's other great matches, and there's loads of other candidates, but I love that Edge match on TV. And the crowning moment of Eddie's career, the title win against Brock Lesnar at No Way Out 2004. But that's just my opinion. I'm keen to know your Mount Rushmore of Eddie Guerrero matches, so leave those in the comment section down below. And thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully a nice look back, a nice tribute to the wildly entertaining career of the legendary Eddie Guerrero. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like button, share and subscribe and all that sort of stuff. If you want to support the channel, head over to my Patreon as well, patreon.com/JackTheJobber. And there's not much more to say. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.